Greetings, I am Mr. O'Neill and I teach English language arts online for K12 and I also coach chess online for K12. The fall season, week 2, regular season just wrapped up for the K12 Esports League and I was not able to record it live, so I'll take a look and analyze a few games after the fact. And there are 12 games total that I've selected to analyze from week 2 of the regular season for chess in the K12 Esports League. Before we get to those games, it would be unfortunate or improper if I did not first acknowledge Daniel Naroditsky, who was an American chess grandmaster, and he passed away at age 29. And he was my third favorite chess player of all time. My favorite chess player of all time is international master Eric Rosen, American chess player. And then my second favorite chess player of all time is American grandmaster Hikaru Nakamura. But Daniel Naroditsky was always my third favorite chess player. And it's really sad that he passed away a couple of days ago. I'm recording this on October 22nd of 2025. And he was only 29 years old when he passed away. And this hits home really hard for me because I'm 35. So I'm already 6 years older than Daniel Naroditsky was when he passed away a couple of days ago. It's just so sad. He was such a bright person and he was an outstanding chess player, one of the best in the world. He won Blitz championships, worldwide Blitz championships. But not only was he such an excellent chess player, Daniel Naroditsky was an even better man. And that should be acknowledged and remembered. He was so humble. When he played, I watched him play a chess game blindfolded. And at the end of the match, he won, but he apologized to his opponent, who was Anna Kramling, and he thought that he had messed her up by repeatedly asking her for the time on their clocks, because it was a timed match. She had 5 minutes on her clock, and he had 3 minutes on his clock to start the match. So he was already at a 2-minute disadvantage to start the match. And he won blindfolded. Anna Kramling was not blindfolded. And after he won that chess match, or the chess game, I should say, he just apologized to her because he thought that he had messed her up with continually asking her how much time he had on his clock. And that's how humble he was. He was always thinking about others. And it was just so sad. He was so young at age 29. It just really makes me think about how short life is and how fragile life is. So the Charlotte Chess Center in North Carolina, where Naroditsky trained and worked as a coach, announced his death on social media, calling him a very talented player, educator, beloved educator of the chess community. This article was written by Hannah, I'm not sure how to pronounce her last name. This is from the Associated Press, the AP, so very reliable. The cause of death was not immediately known, and he was consistently ranked in the top 200 worldwide for traditional chess. But Blitz was his favorite. So he actually gave an interview about 6 months ago, and he repeated how much he just adored Blitz chess in particular, which is 5+0 or 3+2, and those types of time controls. And he even said in the interview, I thought it was interesting, he said he would lose sleep at night if his chess.com Blitz rating was less than 3,000. And at the moment of his death, his Blitz rating on chess.com was 3,074. So it's a little bit poetic that his Blitz rating on chess.com was comfortably north of 3,000, which is exactly where he liked to be. He loved streaming. He streamed all the time. I watched his streams all the time. He was just a great person. And if you have a chance, you should go on YouTube and Google Daniel Naroditsky on YouTube and take a look at some of his YouTube videos. Interestingly, he was the son of Jewish immigrants to the United States from Ukraine and Azerbaijan. So, again, highlighting how important it is to have respect for everyone, regardless of what background or place they come from. And he was born and raised in San Mateo County, California. And he spent most of his early years in California. And then he studied history at Stanford. And then he earned a bachelor's there. So, very interesting guy. Good man. Okay, back to the tournament. I am planning on making another video to honor and remember Daniel Naroditsky, but I just wanted to say something very briefly before analyzing games. So week 2, I rook-rolled you, formerly known as DG Checkmate. First place, no surprise. Strongest player across all students who play chess in the Stride K12 world. Second place, Sonic Star 235. Third place, Charles Blanton. Congratulations to all 3 players. And it was close. So I rook-rolled you, ended up with 10 wins, 1 loss, and 37 points. And Sonic Star 235 also had 10 wins, 1 loss, and 34 points. And I believe I rook-rolled you, maybe beat Sonic Star 235 head-to-head is maybe why they finished first. Or they could have won quicker. That could be another reason why they finished ahead. And fourth place, Dr. Evilman 12. All the usual suspects from previous tournaments. Not just in week 1 a week ago, but last school year and the school year before. All the usual suspects in the top 10. Dr. Evilman 12, Budgie 10, Murray the 3rd, Dream Angels 88, relatively new player compared to some of the other names that we've seen. Totally not Jason Voorhees, 7th place. Terrible chess player 50, played them before. Pretty strong player for the, for school aged, for like middle school, high school aged students, 1301. Rift Bando, 9th place, rounding out the top 10, James 317349. And there were so many students who participated in week 2, it bled over onto a second page. So if you click on 2 and go to the second page, all of these students earned points as well in week 2. Interestingly, out of the 37 K12 students who participated in the week 2 chess arena, every single student earned at least a point, except for 3, which is awesome. So many students had success. And you need at least a draw to get a point. So like you see this student, Cheese and Crackers, 834, with the Powerpuff Girls, they scored 1 point because they ended up getting a draw in one of their games, which is awesome. You got to take every little win and take every little positivity you can get in chess and just keep moving forward. And even these students down here at the bottom who didn't score any draws or wins, I'm sure they still learned great information from their games. And in fact, because of their participation, I would like to highlight them. So Nyko Kitty, Grayson BLDES, and Connor J0803. Thank you very much for participating in the tournament. Even though you didn't score any points, I'm sure you learned something from the tournament, and congratulations on your participation. Just keep working hard, and I'm sure you'll at least get a draw in the next round, next week. So as you can see, we had a lot of pairings for week 2. There were so many pairings and games that occurred during week 2. There's 4 pages just on the first set. And then once you get to page 4, it should prompt you to go to page 5, scroll all the way down, and then page 7 is the last page of pairings. So lots and lots of games. And I did select 12 to analyze. And the first one I selected was I Rook Rolled You and Charles Blanton. I Rook Rolled You, of course, 2080 in Rapid, and Charles Blanton has a chess.com rating of 1857, so not too far behind. Both of these players are strong. My own peak Rapid rating is like 1450, 1470, something like that, mid 1400s. So chess.com reported that if you have a Rapid rating of mid 1400s, it ends up being, I want to say, like the 90th percentile on chess.com or something like that. So anything above 1500, I mean, you've been studying chess for a while and you're pretty good, in my opinion. And 2000 is very, very good. You've got to be a very, very good player to hit 2000. So I Rook Rolled You, formerly DG Checkmate. They did end up losing a game. And I can't remember if it was this one or not. But Charles Blanton starts with the King's Opening. And then I Rook Rolled You is countering with the Caro Kann defense. And this is the first time I've seen this game. So I'm analyzing it for the first time along with all of you. And putting some extra pressure on this pawn right away with knight to b3, or c3, I should say. And a lot of times you see this pawn get pushed to g4 right away. But sometimes when you get overextended like that, it can weaken your position. So they just took right off the bat. And then I think this is a good decision to take because you end up doubling the pawns. And normal development, right? Develop your bishops and your knights first. Control the middle of the board with your pawns. Yeah, it had to castle there because if you didn't castle, then you were getting checked. You're going to get checked eventually with the rook. So castling was really important there. And they ended up going rook to e8 anyway to try to control the e-file. Also maintaining control over the e-file, e1 on their own. No need to exchange rooks right away because, for example, if you exchanged right away and then after the queen takes, then now the queen has control over this e-file. And you don't want to give your opponent control over the e-file right away. So good decision, in my opinion, to not exchange rooks right away. And Charles Blanton decides to exchange. And I guess the calculation was the queen doesn't really have a bright future on this e-file since this bishop is strong, creating a semi-open file instead of a fully open file. And the bishop's defending this pawn. Also thoughts of maybe going c3 to reinforce the pawn, or maybe even thoughts of c4 to push these pawns forward. But then you risk having a backwards pawn on d4. And this bishop can't really get pushed out of the way. Like, both of these bishops are pretty strong because they're right in the middle of the board. And they're not really at risk of getting pushed, at least not right away. So we do have c4, which creates a backwards pawn on d5, unless they choose to go here and then reinforce this way. We'll see what happens. Okay, so challenging that backwards pawn right away. Challenging the bishop. Yeah, wanting to maintain this pin. So smart move from I Rook Rolled You. Maintain the pin against the queen. The knight can't actually move anywhere, right? And then this pawn is doing a nice job restricting the knight as well. The knight really has a hard time jumping in anywhere, and then you don't want to lose your queen on the pin. This, I think, is a risky move because you're really opening up the king a lot with a move like g4 right away. Because look at how this bishop is controlling all these squares. This light squared bishop could maybe get redeveloped, and then if white takes, then there's the potential for a pawn cube, how Eric Rosen likes to call it, a pawn cube, and other players refer to that as well. But generally speaking, your king is less safe, and then you also have a backwards pawn at h3. So notice this backwards pawn on h3 is undefended in this position. But it's not so easy for black to attack the undefended h3 pawn right away. And it looks like we do have takes, and we do have the pawn cube, a black cube, not to be confused with a Borg cube from Star Trek. Not a funny joke. We'll just move on. And creating a pin of our own along this diagonal. And the knight could move, I guess, because the queen is still being defended by the rook, but adding some pressure. Takes. Interesting decision to take with the knight instead of the bishop, probably because this bishop is doing a nice job restricting this queen. The queen doesn't really have a bright future on the semi-open e-file since the bishop is still here. Okay, so going after the queen with c5, have to move the queen. And we have an exchange. And reinforcing the defense of this knight, also getting some X-ray vision on this bishop, and this bishop is undefended. So Charles Blanton is threatening a discovered attack. So as soon as this knight moves, we have an attack on this undefended bishop. And I rook rolled you, of course, saw that. They're a strong player, 2080, so they moved the bishop out of the way of the rook's X-ray vision. And still continuing the attack with the knight going after the bishop. Although normally bishops are equal with knights, but if you listen to Gary Kasparov and other chess experts and grandmasters, they'll tell you that in most positions, especially open positions like this one, bishops are a little bit stronger. So technically a bishop and a knight are 3 points apiece, but bishops are really more like 3.5 points, 3.5 points, and knights are still at 3 points, technically, especially in these open positions. So if you have a chance to exchange a knight for a bishop in these open positions, go for it, usually. And closed positions, where there's still lots of pieces on the board, knights are generally stronger than bishops. So something to think about. And I rook rolled you, content to have the exchange, it looks like, with reinforcing the defense of this knight, because the knight was being attacked by the bishop, and the knight was undefended. So you have to defend the knight. Although if you take, then now I rook rolled you has isolated pawns, and that would be very weakening. So maybe instead of defending with the pawn, I rook rolled you could like move the knight back this way, or maybe even jump into e4. And they've got lots of time on their clocks, so it's not like they're pressed for time. But the issue with this move is if there's an exchange, then a rook rolled you has to retake with this b pawn, and then his pawns are disconnected. And in endgames, you want to have connected pawns, because when pawns are isolated and not defending each other, then they're much easier to attack. So then I rook rolled you would have an undefended pawn on c5, and I rook rolled you would have another undefended pawn on a7, which would be very vulnerable. So in the game, there's takes. And what I would have done is pawn takes. And I think they end up doing rook takes, if I remember correctly. So the idea behind pawn takes is you're undoubling your pawns and you're getting yourself a better pawn structure. But a rook rolled you's happy with the pawn cube, which is technically a Rosen trophy. Rosen trophy. If you go on Google and type in Rosen trophy, there's a website you can visit. It's kind of funny. You just type in your chess.com name, it analyzes all your games, and it tells you how many Rosen trophies you've won. And pawn cube is one of the Rosen trophies, I'm pretty sure. So we have takes, check. That's the only legal move that doesn't lose immediately. I mean, you could block with the rook, but then you're losing your rook. So going after the knight right away, knight has to move. This is a fork, forking this pawn and this pawn. But a rook rolled you is not going to go down without a fight. So they're immediately going after this pawn to attack it. So if you take this undefended pawn right away, they're going to take this pawn, and this pawn on b4 is not being defended. So it makes sense to either take or push, and Charles Blanton decides to push. Now, just remember that this pawn on c4 is also undefended. You know, when you get into these endgames, you get a lot of undefended pawns, and the player who can capitalize on undefended pawns the fastest usually wins. So going after the undefended pawn right away, and then not only defending the undefended pawn, but challenging the undefended rook on e4. So not exchanging, just calmly moving back to e5, keeping the rooks on the board. And we have a repetition. So the rook goes back to e4, going after this pawn on c4 again. And we were almost at risk of a draw here, you know, going back and then going back like this. And this is an even position. You know, nobody's up any material here. But nice little move to block the attacked pawn with the bishop. The bishop's also being defended by the rook. The rook's also keeping an eye on this undefended pawn. Check. The king has to move. Probably could have gone after this pawn, like a1. a1 to go after this pawn, but then you're losing this pawn. I mean, something to think about. You also could create a double attack by going after this pawn, because this bishop is attacking this pawn, and the knight's defending, but you could create a double attack with rook to b7, or create a double attack on this pawn. So just, you know, other moves to think about. This is a strong move too, because it's creating a pin. You know, the bishop can't actually move anywhere because the bishop is pinned against the rook. So let's see how Charles Blanton gets out of the pin. And Charles Blanton decides, okay, I'll just bring my king into the game to go after the rook on d1, and maybe that'll break up the pin. Because pins are not great. Because as long as this pin exists, this knight is free to go wherever it wants. Like this knight could jump into b2 to go after this pawn if it wanted. And then like if you slide the rook over to c7 to defend the undefended pawn, then you're losing your bishop. So this is a really tricky position for Charles Blanton. And just remember, like if one piece is pinning one piece against another piece, like this rook can't really move laterally because then you're losing your bishop. And then this bishop can't move either, because if the bishop moves, then you're losing your rook. So this is a really strong position for a rook rolled you. And wisely, b2 right away, going after the undefended pawn. And going after the rook. So now, if you take the undefended pawn, you're losing a rook. So Charles Blanton is just in time to save his position. And he was in some trouble here at first. So you have to move the rook to get out of the way of the king. Probably you could have put your rook on d3 as well. But the problem with putting your rook on d3, even though it's being defended by the knight is now tied down to defending the rook. And the knight can't actually move. So then it creates a situation where the king is kind of pinning the knight against the rook a little bit. It's not technically called a pin, but the knight is tied down to defending the rook if you would have put your rook on d2. And of course, you can't put the rook on d2 or on d2 because then it's not being defended. But d3 is what I meant to say there, because you don't want to occupy your knight with just defending the rook the whole game. You want your pieces to move around. So rook to b1, getting out of the way of the queen. Now they take the undefended pawn, going after the rook because the rook's undefended. The rook wisely is now keeping an eye on this pawn, and the knight's attacking it. This rook could come in to create a double attack, which we see in the game, and that leaves that knight undefended. Bishops can move backwards, so this was a blunder from I rook rolled you. As soon as you're moving this rook over to create a double attack, that's the idea. You've only got one defender, and now you've got two attackers, so really trying to create a double attack here on this pawn. But as soon as you move the rook over, bishops can move backwards, and there goes the knight. So now you're up an entire minor piece. And there is a fork, so it's not totally lost, because I rook rolled you can win the bishop right back again with the fork, forking the king and the bishop. And then we have bishop takes, so I rook rolled you is still fighting back, going after the undefended pawn. Of course, wanting to take the undefended pawn on a2, take the undefended pawn on b6. Now you've got two passed pawns against one passed pawn, and normally two passed pawns will be a winning position outright against one passed pawn. It's just a matter of converting this into a win. But theoretically, this would be a win for Charles Blanton. And there goes another undefended pawn. And there's a check. So the check is important because when you're moving your king, you're losing tempos to advance your own pawn, right? As long as you keep getting checked, you're losing tempos to advance your own pawn. Now, as long as you're not getting checked by a pawn, then your opponent is losing tempos to advance their own pawns as well. So now we see the pawns marching down the board. It's a race. Who's going to win the race? Everybody wants to get a queen. Wisely keeping an eye on the promotion square on a1. And allowing white to promote. Potentially you could see, something like this, like to keep an eye on the promotion square, but then the problem is and you could also, this is a tough position for I rook rolled you because the rook is getting overworked. And you also don't want to go like h8 right away because then you're just losing your rook, right? Because this rook is already controlling this back rank. So that would be a blunder. But like normally you'd want to have your rook on c1, because the point of having your rook on c1 is you're keeping an eye on the promotion square this way, and you're also keeping an eye on the promotion square this way. But it was hard for you to get your rook on c1 right away because originally your rook was on a3. So it's taking you two moves to get to c1 because your rook originated on a3, or h3, I should say. So we have a queening, and then check. Could have promoted right away, but then you're losing your queen to the rook. So check. And then now they promote. And then I thought it was interesting that they decided to deliver a check here instead of just taking the queen. I think it's a perfectly winning position if you take the queen with your rook right away, because then black doesn't have a queen anymore, and black's not close to getting a queen. But they delay with check, check, check. All these checks, the rook is still attacking the queen, and the queen has nowhere to move because you're in check. So check, and that's checkmate. So the queen is stuck in the corner and has no way to defend against all these checks. And eventually it's checkmate because the rook's defending the queen, the pawn is preventing the king from running to safety, and then the king is preventing the king from running to safety here. So, strong game from Charles Blanton. And this was the only loss that I rickrolled you had throughout the game, throughout the whole arena tournament. So, but I rickrolled you, ended up getting the last roll because they won the whole arena, even though they lost. And it was unrated, so their rating didn't go down or anything like that. And next game that we'll analyze is Budgie 10 and Dr. Evilman 12, both highly rated players, 1853 and 1843, respectively. Only 10 points difference between the two. So very, very close in rating. With the white pieces, Dr. Evilman 12 starts with a King's opening, and then we have a Caro-Kann defense right away. So this is exactly the same opening that we had in the previous game, but two totally different players from the previous game, but same opening. So this is trendy. King's opening met with the Caro-Kann. And controlling both squares right in the middle of the board right away with d4 and takes. You could also probably push here, and the pawn is being defended by d4, but this works too. Have to defend the pawn somehow, because that pawn was being undefended and the knight was going after it. And then not only is this pawn defending this pawn, but the pawn is also restricting the knight. So anytime you have a pawn that is two squares directly in front of a knight, it does a nice job of restricting that knight's development. And bishop is activated. This is almost like a reverse London system. Chess.com is calling it the Caro-Kann Defense Exchange Rubinstein variation. But going after the queen right away. And also acceptable would have been knight to f3, putting yourself into a pin. Keep your queen on d1, put yourself into a pin by going knight to f3, developing your knight, developing a minor piece, and then your next move you're going to kick the rook, or the bishop, I should say. This is also good. This is kind of trendy. A lot of players are doing this. Queen to b3, and the point of queen to b3 is you're attacking this pawn, because this pawn's undefended. So we'll see how they defend. Yeah, and this is how I've been defending in my games. I've just been sliding my queen over one spot to defend, and that's perfectly acceptable. Although the engine is not a fan of this move, sliding the queen over to c8, but that's what I've been doing in my games. I can't remember what the engine wants. I want to say pushing would be a good move. Yeah, obviously you can't put the rook here because the bishop is covering this diagonal. So, yeah. You'd have to look at the engine analysis for that. Okay. So finally seeing the other knight activated to f3, like we were talking about earlier, and these knights are defending each other, which is always nice harmony to see the knights. Kicking the bishop away, but not going to, wisely not going to f5. Because if you go to f5, then this bishop's going to take, and then you take with the pawn, and you've kind of ruined your pawn structures. And you don't want to ruin your pawn structure so early in the game if you can help it. So wisely just going back to h5. Castle, castle. Hopping the knight in. And if the bishop ever decides to go back, you can take with the knight instead of the bishop, which is a little bit for choice for white side. Because like we talked about earlier, you normally want to exchange knights for bishops if you can. Because bishops are normally a little bit more powerful than knights by a small margin in most positions. And challenging the knight right away. Now what you could do here is knight to f3. And if this knight takes, then you can just replace it. But you got to remember that this knight is also attacking, so like you've got two knights attacking this knight. So decide to defend with the rook instead. Taking with the pawn. Now you have an isolated pawn on e5. And usually you don't want isolated pawns unless you have a very good reason for having an isolated pawn. So this is already a weakness for Dr. Evilman 12. And this is technically a fork, but not really, because the queen can go back to defend the bishop. But the bishop's not being defended, and you don't want to lose your queen, so the queen has to move. And of course, yeah, that's the most logical move, because now you're defending your bishop, which was undefended. And takes. So in this position, Budgie 10 has the bishop pair, and Dr. Evilman 12 does not have the bishop pair anymore. And they have an isolated pawn on e5. So Budgie 10 definitely has the better position here. It's just a matter of converting. So going after the queen right away, sliding the queen back. Pushing this pawn. That's kind of trendy nowadays too, is pushing your flanked pawns. Eric Rosen likes to do that. Pinning the queen, or pinning the knight against the queen, I should say. Getting the bishop in this game. This bishop is also serving as a blockade against the pawn on b7. Challenging the bishop. Yeah, and you don't want to have doubled pawns again, right? So you kind of have to take there, because if you did, like, let's say you did rook to b1 to like start pushing this, or like let's say you did, b4 right away to go after the bishop. Like if you take and then then now you have doubled pawns on the b file. Doubled pawns on the b file is, you don't want doubled pawns either, because that's very weak. So to avoid doubled pawns on the b file with, again, takes, you have to take with your pawn, doubled pawns, that's weak. So to avoid that, they had to take with the bishop first. Takes, queen is going after the undefended rook, defend the rook, get the knight into the game. That pawn had a double attack on it. You got to watch out for these double attacks, and this is another disadvantage of pushing your pawns too fast. So double attack, queen, rook, only being defended once, takes, and Budgie 10 is slowly improving the position here. Pin. The knight's pinned against the queen. Budgie 10 keeps finding these pins. And not only was it a pin, but attacking that undefended pawn, which Dr. Evilman 12 didn't see. Undefended pawn on b2. Now you have a passed pawn on the outside, on the a file. So now it's just a matter of, bringing this rook into the game. There's an old saying in chess: put your rooks behind passed pawns. So Budgie 10 may eventually put their rook on a8 to help this pawn promote. Going for a queen trade. Bishop's defending the queen. Declining the queen trade, which results in another lost pawn because the pawn on h3 was undefended. And then white resigned here. So Dr. Evilman 12 knew that they didn't have a winning position, and they just resigned. So good game from Budgie 10. Budgie 10 created a lot of pins, took undefended pawns, went after undefended pawns, used pins to their advantage, and then ended up getting a passed pawn of their own on the a file. So really nice game. This pawn eventually is going to promote to a queen, or then you have to sacrifice your rook to take the pawn on a1, and then you're just down a rook. So very nice game from Budgie 10. Dr. Evenman 12 is no slouch, though. 1843 is very highly rated. So Dr. Evenman 12 will be back, I'm sure. Next game, 1unique_10, rated 1600, even, against terrible chess player 50, double ? King's opening. This is the third game in a row we've seen the King's opening. I know the Queen's opening has been a little bit less popular recently, but I still love using the Queen's opening. So takes. The e-file is very open. Yeah, so this pawn is not being defended by the c-pawn, and usually in a lot of these positions, it's nice to have this pawn defended by the c-pawn, like having this c-pawn on c3, and then you have a nice pawn chain on this diagonal. But it's not as big of a deal here because this pawn's being defended twice by the queen and by the knight. So now it's only being defended once because the bishop's blocking the queen's defense. But you want to develop your bishop. Probably could have gone bishop to e2, I think would be perfectly acceptable as well, because then you're adding an extra defense for this knight, and then you're allowing your queen to still defend this pawn as well. Oh. Probably could have taken here. Because if you use your move 7 to take the knight, then after takes, this pawn is not being defended, and then you take the pawn, and then your queen's being hit. Terrible chess player, something to think about for the future. Your pawn is not being defended by the queen because the bishop's in the way. So you only have one. So this is called removing the defender. So 1unique_10 can remove the defender, take the knight, queen takes, knight takes the pawn, and then your queen's being hit by the knight, and you got to move your queen out of the way. And then same thing, if you retake with this pawn, then you've got doubled pawns on the f-file, and then your pawn on a3 is weak. So you kind of got lucky there. Check, have to block the check or move the king. Yeah, and see, unique 10 found the move, knight takes pawn. You can't actually move your knight anywhere because of the pin. Remember? The bishop is pinning the queen. So, and then your queen's also being hit by the knight. So there's some issues here. I gotta stand up for a second. Double attack. As soon as you moved your queen out of the way, because you don't want your queen to be taken by the knight, there's now a double attack on the f3 square. So takes, and then you got to be careful because you don't want to get the royal fork. So if you take with this pawn, then you're getting the royal fork. So take with the pawn to take the bishop back. The knight's going to take the pawn, and then the knight is getting a royal fork against the queen and the king, and then you lose right away. So to avoid that, you kind of have to move your queen out of the way, and unique_10's taking the undefended pawn, going after the rook. Move the rook to g1, and then taking not taking anything, but getting your knight into the game on f3 anyway. The knight's being defended by the bishop. And then this is also a fork, because you're forking the king and the rook. So you're in check. So you either have to take with the queen, but you don't want to take with the queen, because then you're just exchanging your queen for a knight, and that's really bad. So you can't take with the queen because knight's being defended by the bishop. So you kind of have to move your king. You can't put your king on f1 because the bishop's covering f1. Can't put your king on d2 because the knight's covering d2. So you have to slide your king up to e2, or you have to slide your king over to d1. You're losing castling rights. You're going to lose your rook. And there's just a lot of problems in this position. And after you lose your rook, you're going to be losing by more than 5 points, and you're already losing by 5 points to begin with. But one unique _10 was rated 300 points higher than Terrible Chess Player, so they were expected to win. But Terrible Chess Player is still a good player. 1300 is extremely respectable for middle school and high school. So good game from both players here. And we'll go on to the next game. Dream Angels 88, 1136, and a piggy bank 1391. Elo 1136 and 1119 respectively. How much you want to bet we see a King's opening again? Oh, we got a Queen's opening. That was a surprise. Oh, that was a surprise. Queen's opening this time. Okay, Queen's opening from both sides. And you'll notice that Dream Angels 88 did not take the undefended pawn, and you might be wondering why. Because what happens if you take the undefended pawn on c4, then white has e4 right away. And then you've got two white pawns right in the middle of the board. And this pawn on c4 has a discovered attack with the bishop. So the bishop is hitting the undefended pawn on c4 with a discovered attack. But then black would have a double attack on d4 because the queen's defending d4, but black would be hitting d4 twice with the knight and with the queen. So there's something to be said for taking on c4, because then you could get a double attack on d4. And white's not defending the pawn twice yet. Now they are. Okay, so lots of action. There's going to be carnage in the middle of the board very soon. I can feel it. There's a lot of tension here. Allowing the tension. Keeping the tension. White normally wants black to take, because when you take with the bishop, then you're allowing yourself to have more control over the middle squares of the board. Because see here, white wants to exchange a middle outside pawn for a center pawn. So your center pawns are valuable. You know, you want to keep your center pawns on the board unless you're exchanging your center pawn for another center pawn. But almost every time, like 99 times out of 100, you do not want to exchange your center pawn for a middle outside pawn. And the C file, you know, has a middle outside pawn. The F file has middle outside pawns, and these middle pawns on the D file and the E file, you don't want to exchange them for the middle outside pawns, because the middle outside pawns are not as important normally as your middle pawns. So that's probably a big reason why they're not exchanging here. Takes. So a piggy bank 1391. They want to exchange their middle outside pawn for the center pawn. So it makes sense for them, because now they have two middle pawns. Dream Angels 88 only has one middle pawn. Takes. Ooh, yeah. You don't want to... This is getting a little messy, because knight's being attacked here, knight's being attacked here. So takes, and then usually when you see copycat mirror positions like this, the player has the initiative and the tempo is going to be the player who comes out with the material advantage, and in this case, it's white. So you have to take the knight there to maintain material equilibrium. Could have taken, but then you're doubling your pawns. Now you have isolated pawns. So pawn is isolated on c7, a6 pawn is isolated, so these are weak pawns because they're not supporting each other and they're isolated. Meanwhile, white has connected pawns on a1 and b1, or excuse me, a2 and b2. So these pawns are stronger because they're together. Going after the undefended bishop. But now we have some discovery threats right away. So probably would be a good idea to move the queen out of the way of the rook's X-ray vision. Ooh, you can take here. Take the knight with the bishop, and you can't retake the bishop with the pawn because then you're losing your queen. So Dream Angels 88 had a beautiful opportunity to come out with a material advantage. So take the knight with your bishop. White can't retake with the pawn, at least not right away, because the rook is hitting the queen on a discovered attack. Still did not see it. Going after the undefended pawn on f2. Going after the rook. Have to move the rook back. Defending the knight. Have a battery against the king. And this pawn's only being defended once. White's hitting the pawn twice. So you have to defend the pawn an extra time. Otherwise, you're getting forked. Because when the bishop takes on f7, you're in check, and the bishop's forking the king and the rook. So you got to move the rook out of the way of the fork and also defend the pawn. Hopping the knight into the game. Although the bishop is hitting the knight and the rook is hitting the knight as well, but it's tricky because if you move your rook, then this pawn's getting hit by the bishop and queen battery. So moving the queen over to get some extra defense on this pawn, potentially creating a battery of your own on this diagonal if the rook moves out of the way. But you've got a triple attack here because 1, 2, 3. Black is defending 3 times, 1, 2, 3. And if the defense is equal with the attacks, then normally you don't want to attack, but takes. And then now this is a tricky position because if you can't actually move the rook anywhere because of the pin. The bishop is pinning the rook against the king. So the rook can't actually move anywhere because of the pin. You can't put yourself into check. And it's a little bit of a tricky position for Dream Angels 88 to get out of. And take with check, also threatening some discoveries. The rooks are protecting each other, which is nice for a piggy bank 1391. Black is in check, so you got to move the king somewhere, or you can sacrifice the queen. And then, like, assuming black puts the king here, now you're threatening some nasty discoveries with wherever the bishop moves, the rook has a discovered attack against the queen. So yeah, they just move back. They just move their bishop back to d5. Discovered attack against the queen. But you can delay the attack against the queen by delivering a check of your own. King moves. Have to move the queen because the queen is getting attacked. Taking the bishop. And that's a double attack. That's a double attack. Bishop has a double attack here. 1, 2 attackers, only 1 defender, double attack. So white is winning more material here. You can't actually take the bishop back with the rook, because if you do, then you're losing your rook to the queen. So taking the knight, but then losing your queen, that's a blunder, it seems like. Lost your queen in exchange for the... So you're taking a knight and a rook in exchange for the queen. So a knight is 3 points, a rook is 5 points, 5 plus 3 is 8. A queen is 9 points. So you're theoretically only losing 1 point with this sacrifice. Takes, losing your queen, check. And that's checkmate, because you've got back rank issues. You've got some major back rank problems here. So, yeah, this rook is the only thing preventing the king from getting back rank mated, because these rooks have a lot of power. And when the rooks are in open files like this, it's very, very powerful. So black can't actually move their rook off of the back rank because of the back rank checkmate issues. So takes, and really, instead of taking the rook, you could have just gone d8 right away. And that would have been forced checkmate, right? d8 right away. So yeah, d8, check, have to block the check by going like this, and then you're losing your queen, and then that's checkmate. And we ended up seeing that sequence anyway. It just happened. Oh, I thought they took the rook. Oh, they did not take the rook. Oh, for some reason I thought they took the rook. I got confused there for a second. See, even I make mistakes sometimes. So yeah, they did not take the rook on b3. They just went for the checkmating idea right away because of the back rank mate issues. Really nice game from a piggy bank 1391. They were in control. Queen sacrifice for a checkmate. That is a Rosen trophy. Sacrificing a queen for a checkmate. That is a Rosen trophy. Congratulations, a piggy bank 1391. Dream Angel 88 also played very well. Very respectable game. All right. Next game, X Snowy XX 1053. Totally not Jason Voorhees 790. King's opening. The pawn is being defended by the queen. This pawn's being defended by the knight. Usually when you see this pawn to d6 move, it's because you're preparing e5 later in the game. And then this setup is also known as a King's Indian, because you're getting ready to put your knight on f6, and then you're going to do short castles. So that's known as a King's Indian defense. So chess.com is calling it the modern defense standard 2 knights variation. Oh, yeah, Pirc defense, classical. But this is also known as King's Indian. Have a pin. And you see these pins a lot. So for that reason, I sometimes like to have my bishop on e2. And the bishop on e2 does a nice job of defending the knight, because you don't ever want to retake with your pawn, because you don't want to have doubled pawns on the f file. So the other way that you can do it is, if you don't want to have your bishop here defending the knight, you could, the knight on b1, instead of developing the b1 knight to c3, develop this knight to d2. And then the knights are defending each other. That's another way to do it. Put your b1 knight on d2. The knights would defend each other that way. And then your queen is free to move around wherever she wants. And the other advantage of having your b1 knight on d2 is this pawn is free to get pushed to c3 to defend this pawn. Or you could even push this pawn all the way to c4 if you wanted to later in the game. But right now, this knight on c3 is blockading your own pawn and preventing your own c pawn from developing. Takes, takes. So going after the knight right away. This pawn is isolated, but it's being defended. Although not really because of the pin. So this knight is kind of useless defending this pawn because the bishop is still pinning the knight against the queen. So takes, you cannot actually take. Cannot take because of the pin. So exchange queens first. Good idea. Takes. Takes. That knight was not being defended. So you basically sacrificed a knight for a pawn. 3 minus 1 is 2. Sure enough, totally not Jason Voorhees is +2 here. Because Snowy XX sacrificed their knight for a pawn. Do some counting. 1, 2, 3, 4 minor pieces. 1, 2, only 3 minor pieces. 4 minor pieces to 3 minor pieces. So this should be a win for totally not Jason Voorhees, in theory, since they're winning by a minor piece. Takes, takes. Doubled pawns, very weakening. Pawns are not very strong when they're doubled. Now, this is technically an inaccuracy. Why? Can the bishop be trapped here in this position? Pause the video. Unpause the video. b6 traps the bishop. Bishop can't go here because the bishop's getting, you'll lose the bishop to the rook. Bishop can't go here because the pawn's defending this pawn after you push the pawn to b6, which they don't find. That's unfortunate. b6 traps the bishop. Bishop has nowhere to go. And the pawn's being defended. And then you can just swing this rook over and win the bishop. Defend the undefended pawn. Going after the rook. Going after the undefended pawn. Taking the undefended pawn. This pawn's also undefended. That pawn's undefended. Lots of undefended pawns. The rook was also not being defended. You got to be careful here. In fact, probably could have taken the rook right away. Like, I'm not sure, so totally not Jason Voorhees. Maybe they just didn't have the board vision to see this, but you can take the rook right away here. You don't have to take the pawn first. Don't have to take the pawn first. You can take the rook right away because rooks are 5 points. Bishops are only 3. So rooks are more powerful than bishops. But once you do take the pawn, the rook's not being defended. So Snowy XX might think that these pawns are free game, but really not, because this rook is being attacked now, and it's undefended since the pawn got taken. So now you're losing your rook. Going after the bishop, taking another pawn, going after the bishop, but you can just move the bishop out of the way. Yeah, your rook's not being defended here, so you should have moved your rook. You know, bishops can move backwards. Instead of moving the knight, just take the bishop. Not sure why you did that. Yeah, just take the bishop next time. And then, and you got plenty of time on your clock. I mean, 9 minutes and 8.5 minutes. So this knight is not being defended. This bishop is also not being defended. So Snowy XX is having a chance to get back in the game. So you have the choice of taking the undefended bishop or the undefended knight. and they choose to take the undefended knight. So now they're only down by 4 points instead of 7. Taking the rook. Ooh, could have taken the bishop there. Bishop's not being oh, I guess the bishop is being defended by the knight. Never mind. And yeah, taking the bishop, and then after you take, then you're still down by 9 points. So Snowy Double X resigned in this position. Good game from both players. And this was an upset because Totally Not Jason Voorhees rated 1790. X Snowy Double X rated 1053. So the underdog won here. Very nice. Good game from both players. And that's the only time they've played. 0-0 and 1. That's the only time they've played. So I imagine they'll play again in the future. And they're over 1,000. So they've won their fair share of games. To be rated over 1,000, they've definitely won their fair share of games. I'm sure we'll see them again later. Another game from Totally Not Jason Voorhees, but this time Vincent JK 2011. So we have a King's opening and a Queen's opening. Closed Scandinavian defense. Yeah, and I play this as black too, so if I'm playing with the black pieces, I open with the Queen's opening no matter what. And if white starts with the King's opening, like this, and you start with the Queen's opening no matter what, it's known as a Scandinavian defense. And the point of the Scandinavian is that you're challenging white right away with this pawn tension. And your queen's defending the pawn. So since the queen's defending the pawn, white decided, well, I better add an extra attacker. And what I do in these positions is I just take. But you can also go... the issue with putting your pawn here is then you're kind of blocking your bishop off from getting developed. Like if your bishop ever wanted to develop... I mean, you can't develop your bishop right away because the pawn's, the pawn has an eye in f5, but like later in the game, you could potentially develop your bishop to f5, and you can't develop your bishop to f5 if your pawn is blocking that development by going here to e5, or e6, I should say, to defend the pawn. So what you could do instead is just go, boom, knight to f6, defends the pawn, and you're good. Let's see what they do here. Oh, they take. Yeah, that's what I would have done. I would have taken. But you could have also just defended it with an extra piece by going knight to f6, and then you're defending your pawn an extra way. That's perfectly acceptable. Takes. Going after the knight right away. Remember what I said? Usually you want to develop your bishop here to f5. If you don't develop your bishop to f5, you could also develop your bishop to g4, assuming your knight is here to defend the bishop. And you could also fianchetto the bishop by placing the bishop on f7. That's another way that you can develop your bishop. But basically, you want to make sure that all of your pieces have bright futures. And these are the main ways you want your bishop to have a bright future. Fianchetto it by putting it on b7 after you move this pawn. Bishop to f5. Bishop to g5, assuming this knight is here to defend the bishop. So those are all the really standard ways to get your bishop developed. This is kind of an unusual move, bringing the queen out so early in the game. And normally you don't want to bring your queen out early. Normally you want to move your knight back, or probably be the better move here, just to move your knight back. Takes, developing a minor piece, hitting the queen. So Totally Not Jason Voorhees has a better position already right off the bat. Developing a knight, hitting the queen. Really nice. Have to move the queen back. Probably could have gone back here, challenging this queen, and then you just retake with the bishop. but then your bishop's kind of blocking your d pawn from developing, so that's not ideal. And then with your d pawn not developing very quickly, then you would have to probably fianchetto, since this bishop doesn't have a bright future. So, yeah. Now you're kind of forced to having to fianchetto your bishop since you're blocking your bishop this way. Makes sense. Bishop doesn't really have a bright future on these light squares because you're blocking yourself in here. This pawn's not being defended. Kind of have to do something about that. And your queen is really misplaced here. Because normally when your queen's on this side of the board, it helps defend a lot of these squares on this side. But since your queen's not on this side of the board anymore, it's not like this pawn is really weak. This c2 pawn is really weak. So you're going after c2 right away. Take it with check. Can't castle. Have to move your king. You don't have any pieces attacking or defending c2. Check. Move back. Probably getting ready to double up, I would imagine. Moving the rook over to d8. Check. Taking with the queen. Also hitting this undefended pawn on b7. Okay, pawn's being defended now that there's castles. Getting the battery. I'm sure they see it. Bishop queen battery is ready to hit this pawn for checkmate. So checkmate in 1. That pawn's not being defended, but it's a poison pawn. Why is it a poison pawn? Pause the video. Unpause the video. If you take with the queen, you're losing the queen because the knight's defending. So I guess the pawn is being defended by the knight. If you take this way, then this battery is powerful on this file. So take with the pawn, check, and then you'd probably want to take with the queen here. Or you can take with the bishop too. That's interesting, because the pawn's defending this square. Why would you put the bishop on f4? Yeah, you can just take the bishop there. It does ruin your pawn structure, but just take the bishop. Oh yeah, there's checkmate. There. Nice. So Vincent, JK 2011, had a discovered checkmating idea. This is tricky. King slides over because you're in check. Don't worry about taking the bishop. You have a discovered checkmating idea. And you're also attacking the knight at the same time. So attacking the knight, you have the bishop and queen battery, discovered checkmate. Which they did not see. And that's checkmate. Another upset. Another underdog win. Very nice. If you see this bird, it's these blue and yellow birds. See how it's blue and yellow at the same time? The blue and yellow represents the blue and yellow flag for Ukraine. So chess.com gives you an option to support Ukraine by placing a blue and yellow bird next to the American flag, or whatever flag, whatever country you're in. So, and it's free. It doesn't cost any money. Next game. How many games do we have left? 5 games left. This is a King's opening version of the London. Chess.com is just calling it a Bishop's opening. Yeah, going for a quick scholar's mate, because the bishop and the queen had a double attack. The issue with taking the queen here, the knight's defending the pawn here, so you're just losing a queen. That's why it's important to not activate your queen so early, because when you activate your queen really, really early, you're at high risk of losing it. You should only activate your queen early if you know opening theory, or if you really know what you're doing, or if you have a really, really good reason to do it. So, although the bishop was not being defended, so, yep. So you lost your queen and your bishop right to start the game. There's check. And when you're winning a bunch of material, you want to exchange as much as you can, and when you exchange material, then you'll win faster. So not only is this check, but you're also hitting this undefended pawn and then going after the rook, potentially as well. Oh yeah, could have taken the pawn there. Instead of developing the knight's perfectly fine. I mean, all roads lead to Rome here, because Rift Bando is winning by 11 points against and Void 161. They're both rated about the same, right around 600. Yeah, the pawn's not being defended. Now the rooks are defending each other, but the knight was not being defended, so, you're losing a knight. Yeah, because the problem is this is a fork. So the queen is forking the knight and the rook. So you got to choose which one you want to lose. You want to lose the knight, you want to lose the rook. Well, like if you move the knight, like if you put the knight on h4 to attack the queen, then the rook's going down, and then you're also getting checked. And then as soon as the king moves to either of these squares, then this queen is going to come and swipe the other rook. So then now you're losing both rooks, right? So you can lose both rooks, or you can lose the knight. You use your choice, because this is a fork. You're forking the knight and then this stuff down here at the bottom, because you've got some back rank problems. So choosing to lose the knight is better, which was the right decision. Could have also taken the pawn with your queen, and then the knight's defending the queen. If you're not careful, sometimes you end up with a draw. You can't do that, because the rook is defending the back rank. I mean, and these rooks are connected, so these rooks are defending each other. And yeah, I'm not sure why you did that. I mean, you're winning by 16 points. So after you lose your queen, you're still winning by 7 points. But that was a blunder. So let's see if you were still able to convert. Yeah, taking the knight. Now you're only winning by 6 points, 5 points. So you were winning by 16. Now you're only winning by 5 points. So and Void 161 is quickly coming right back into the game. There's no back rank check here, because the king can escape to g7, so there's no back rank checkmate problems here. But your pawn is not being defended on a2. Okay, the bishop's not being defended, so probably should have moved the bishop there. There goes the bishop. Now black is threatening checkmate on d1. Still threatening checkmate on d1. Oh, that was a blunder. Bishop to d1. I mean, I guess that's not checkmate, because you can move this rook down to block. I guess that's not checkmate. Never mind. Okay, that's a good move, because now you've got the battery on this pawn. Yeah, battery's on this pawn, so the pawn's probably going down. Oh, not taking the pawn, trying to promote instead. Yeah, because the issue is these rooks are strong when they're connected, but the problem that Rift Bando has here is as soon as you move these rooks away from each other, they're weakened a lot. So you can see the rook moves away, the rooks are not defending each other anymore, and then now you've got check. The only legal move is to block, check, and then the next move is to block this way, and then you're getting checkmated. So Rift Bando ended up winning. And Void 161 almost came back because they went from down by 16 to only down by 5. So that's a huge swing. 16 to 5, that's a 9-point swing. That's an entire queen. So yeah, really well fought game by and Void 161 to come almost all the way back. And Rift Bando almost blew a big lead, but they were able to still hang on at the end. Next game, Sonic Star 235, 1186. Mary II, 1104. Another King's Opening. Are we surprised? No, we are not. You got to be careful. You're getting forked. There's a double attack. Mary II's a good player. Bishop's hitting this pawn. Knight's hitting this pawn. You're getting forked. That's exactly what we see in the game. Ooh, tricky. Sacrificing the bishop. If you take the bishop, then this knight's coming into the game with check. Take the bishop. Even trickier. Not going this way, but taking the pawn with check. This is some crazy line. Yeah, this is the Traxler. This is the Traxler. Italian game. Knight sacrifice line. Crazy. So this is the Traxler from Black's perspective. And you can go on YouTube and Google Traxler, and you'll see a bunch of stuff. The Traxler is very popular. So you have to move the king somewhere because you're in check. Activating the queen right away. If you could take the rook, but look at how active these pieces are. And then the queen's also has some X-ray vision on this bishop, and your bishop's not being defended. So white has some serious problems here. I mean, and look at this king. The king is on e3. That is so unsafe. Just a crazy, wild position. King's on e3, very unsafe. The queen has some X-ray vision on the bishop. So there's a discovered attack. As soon as this knight moves, there's a discovered attack against the bishop. Okay, taking the rook. So Murray II's temporarily up by 7. But Sonic Star 235 still has a huge attack. Queen's being defended by the pawn. Look at this king on d3. Could not put the king here. Could potentially put the king on e2. Yeah, it's just such a tricky position. Putting the king on d3, I'm not sure if that was the right move. King to e2. I think that works. The issue is that this bishop can't get activated right away. Because in some of these lines, what'll happen is, like, let's say the king goes back to e2, which is, in theory, a little bit safer. You're getting the bishop hit with this pawn, and then you're getting a nasty shish kebab. So king goes to e2 to get out of the check. Then black's next move is to hit this bishop like this. And then when this pawn moves to d5 to attack the bishop, you could take the pawn right away. But then you're getting hit with this nasty shish kebab when the bishop goes to g4, checks the king, and then you're winning the queen on the next move. Nasty shish kebab. So that's probably the reason why Murray II wanted to put their king on d3 to avoid this nasty shish kebab on these light squares diagonal. But then you're getting checked anyway. So knight to b4 check. And look at all of white's pieces. You've got a king, you've got a knight, you have a knight that's doing absolutely nothing in the corner. You have a bishop that's staring on all of these empty squares, not doing much either. Your king is on d3, totally exposed. And you've got 5 undeveloped pieces. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 undeveloped pieces on the back rank. Meanwhile, black has 3 developed pieces in the middle of the board going after this king. Super scary position. Finally, have to go here. I mean, the pawn's covering d4, so you can't put your king there. This knight is covering c3, so you can't keep moving your king there. And that's checkmate. So you could even, like all the nasty shish kebab stuff I was mentioning, you don't even have to worry about doing the shish kebab stuff anymore with trying to win the queen. Bishop check against the king to win the queen. You don't even have to worry about that line because this is checkmate. And normally the king could go back to d3 to get out of check. But with this knight here, the knight is doing a nice job of covering d3. And then this knight is protecting the queen. So all 3 of these pieces are coordinating with each other. And Murray II is winning by 7 points. Murray II plus 7. Darth Vader. Winning by 7 points, but still getting checkmated. Because there's a huge attack with the Traxler. And this is why it's important to know the Traxler. You can lose a bunch of material and still get a checkmate. Really exciting game. This is probably the best game I've seen all year. Losing by 7 points, which is the equivalent of a rook and 2 pawns, but still getting a checkmate. With a huge attack on the Traxler. Really nice game from Sonic Star 235. Game of the year. Double exclamation points. And guess what? That's what they have for their profile. Double exclamation points. Very fitting. Next game. We have doubles again, but this time instead of double exclamation points, we have double question marks. Terrible Chess Player 50 against Paper Player 59, who we have not seen yet. So this is the first game we're analyzing from Paper Player 59. 1301 and 877 respectively. King's opening. Italian game. Yeah, anti-fried liver defense. So like white's going after this idea. So this is the fried liver. And you're going after this pawn twice. But black is defending against this square right away. The other way to do this is instead of defending this square by going here, the other way you can do it is this. And you're defending this pawn and protecting this square. One of the problems potentially is if you go like this to defend the pawn again and also defend this square so the knight doesn't jump in, then you could potentially lose a knight. And then when you retake the bishop with your rook, then you're forced to castle queenside. So Like normally you don't want to take a knight for a bishop in most positions, because bishops are maybe a tiny little bit stronger than knights in most positions. But the benefit in that line is that you're forcing black to castle queen side instead of castling king side. And then you can have a long-term attack on the queen side instead of the king side. So, castles. Oh, yeah. Now you're threatening to double a white's pawns. Yep. Now we have doubled pawns on the C file, just what I had thought might happen. Pin. Knight's getting pinned. This is an aggressive move. You're pushing this D pawn in hopes that you can potentially undouble your pawn structure, and you can retake with this pawn. But the issue is takes, knight's going to come in and take. You can't take back this way because of the pin. You could take back with the queen, but the issue with taking back with the queen is then now these pawns are getting doubled. You're going to end up having doubled pawns on the F file because your queen is getting overworked. Your queen's getting overworked between defending this knight and defending this square. So let's see what happens here. Yeah, takes. You've undoubled your pawns on the C file, which is great. Okay, they're not going to take because that would be a bit of a sacrifice. I mean, you could sacrifice your knight here, and then after takes. Now they've doubled their pawns again, and this king is open because there's no pawns in front of the king on the G file. So the king's a lot more exposed, and they've got doubled pawns on the F file. So you could sacrifice the knight in exchange for exposing their king a little bit and then getting doubled pawns on the F file. But yeah, I got to move the knight around. Bishop's not being defended. Ooh, bishop is not being defended there. Paper player 59. You're not defending your bishop. There goes the bishop. Moved the rook out of the way, yeah, because the knight was attacking the rook. This bishop, even though it has not moved from its starting square, is restricting the knight. So the knight can't hop into any of these squares because the bishop is restricting the knight. So the bishop is still on its starting square, which is not great. You want to get your minor pieces activated. So bishops and knights, get them activated early on. Look at how terrible chess player is not terrible because they've already developed their knights and their bishops off of their starting squares, very active pieces. You got to get your pieces active. Get your pieces off of their starting squares as soon as you can. Okay, now takes, going after the rook. Going after the knight. This is a double attack. The knight's only being defended once. You're hitting it with the battery. Bishop and queen battery. Yeah, knights are defending each other, but the bishop was covering that diagonal. That's check. Taking the pawn with check. There's a shish kebab pin. Shish kebab pin. Can't move the rook anywhere because of the pin. Takes. Yep. This bishop's not being defended. So there goes the bishop. That's a discovered check because no matter where the bishop moves, you're getting checked. That's a fork. So rook is forking the king and the queen. So the queen's, you have to sacrifice the queen to take the rook, which they do. And the king is squirmy. King is very squirmy. Not quite checkmate yet. Queen's being defended by the knight. That's why the queen couldn't be taken. Discovered checkmate. So the pawn moves. As soon as the pawn moves, discovered checkmate. Rook is covering the back rank. The bishop is covering this square. The knight is covering this square. So the king's kind of in the corner, but you've got 4 pieces. 1, 2, 3, 4. You've got 4 pieces all working together to deliver the checkmate. Nice game. And this is not an upset. 13 versus 1877. Over a 400-point difference. 2 games left. King's opening. Lots of exchanges here. Still an even position. Yeah, so notice how Dr. K12 wants to develop on the queen side as much as possible to get a big attack with these pawns. And they've castled on opposite sides. So when you castle on opposite sides like this, it's a race to see who can attack the other king the fastest with their pawns. So you can see Dr. K12 has a nice pawn storm on the king side. And Terrible Chess Player has no pawn storm on the queen side. So Dr. K12 is already winning this game. Now, if you look at the points, it's a knight and a pawn for a knight and a pawn. So there's no material advantage here. It's 0-0. But if you look at the position, well, white has a big advantage because they've got a massive pawn storm on the king side, ready to attack black's king and open things up. Yeah, I mean, you start exchanging pieces like this. This rook has a nice open file. I mean, this bishop's going to get developed. And then the rooks are going to connect. Takes. Oh, you can take that way too, I guess. I would have taken with this pawn. But then that probably works too. All roads lead to Rome. Shish kebab. Bishop is pinning the queen against the rook. And instead of taking the rook right away, they're just exchanging queens off the board. They just take the bishop, continue with the pawn storm. Defend the bishop and create a discovered attack. So no matter where the bishop goes, the king's getting checked. King goes back to avoid the discovery, but you still have a discovered attack this way if you take the pawn. Yep, so there's a discovered attack or discovered check. Yeah, you can't really take the pawn there because if you're taking the pawn, take the pawn, then you're getting hit with another discovered check, and then you got to move your king back again, and then you're getting checked again this way, and you kind of have to move your bishop. You have to move your knight down here, and then the other rook is coming into the game for checkmate. So takes. Now you have a double attack on the pawn. But that ends up being checkmate anyway. So all roads lead to Rome, remember? Chess GM 209A against Rek K-less Bomber 13. Chess GM is not a GM because GMs are rated usually over 2,500, 2,400, right in that range, and they're at 679, so they're not a GM, but they've got GM in their name. A lot of players will put GM in their name because it kind of looks cool, like short for Grandmaster, but Real grandmasters are north of 2400, if not higher. Queen's opening. Queen's Gambit accepted. Have not seen a Queen's Gambit. Now the traditional theory is e4 right away, and you've got a strong center. Oh, they did not do e4. They did e3. That still works. The issue with e3, though, is now you're blocking your bishop. Your bishop needs to get developed to f4. You cannot develop your bishop to f4 when you're blocking it in like that. So you kind of have to fianchetto. Develop your bishop that way. Fianchetto, put your bishop on b2. Yeah, you don't want to develop your bishop so early in the game. Or your queen, I meant to say. Bad idea. Don't want to develop your queen so early in the game. You want to develop your bishops and your knights first. Develop your bishops and your knights first. So we have a queen exchange. The pawn was not being defended. Okay, there's check. Okay, that's a double attack. 1, 2, only defending it once. Ooh, could have taken there, and then you're threatening to win the rook on a fork. So take with the knight first. Have to take back with the pawn. Take the pawn with the bishop with check, and then you're winning the rook. Because the dark squared bishop's on the same diagonal as the king and the rook on those dark squares. Moving the knight away. Okay, now we see it potentially. Oh, not taking the rook. Fancy. So you could go here to defend the bishop, but then after takes, you're losing material. So this is fancy. Taking the pawn, but the knight's not being defended. So take the undefended knight. You're taking with check, but the knight's defending. So it ends up being +1 after all that mess. It ends up being +1 for chess 2009A, or 209A rather. Yeah, one of the issues with this move is now you can take and then you got doubled pawns on the A file. So doubled pawns are bad. Remember, doubled pawns are very weak. Oh, they castled instead of taking. Also hitting the rook. Have to move the rook. Now you're taking. Now you got doubled pawns. Doubled pawns are weak, just like we talked about. Yeah, I'm not sure why you would go pawn to d5 right away, because there's nothing supporting this pawn on d5. You know, the pawn on d5 is all by itself, not being supported by anything. So this is just a pawn sacrifice. Going after the undefended b pawn. Takes, going after the undefended knight. Knight's not being defended. Check. The rook is very unhappy. The rook does not have a bright future. Sitting on h8. Now technically, black is winning by 2 points here, which is the equivalent of 2 pawns. But really, black is losing by 3 points because the rook on h8 that's worth 5 points, this rook on h8 that's normally worth 5 points is worth 0 points. So and there's checkmate. And that's the last game. Have a good game. Have a good day, everybody. So nice game from Chess GM 209A, because there's back rank issues here on the back rank. Yep. Very good tournament. I'll talk to you later, everybody.